My guest today is Professor Katrine Løken, who is Professor of Economics at the Norwegian School of Economics. Her main research interests are in early investments in children and the long-term outcomes and effects of different social policies. Welcome, Katrine.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, thanks for doing this. So I got a number of your very interesting papers, and I want to start with thanks for doing this very late in Norway, by the way.
That's all
uh,
good.
I'm going to start with peer effects and program participation.
Mhm.
You say here we estimate peer effects and paid paternity leave in Norway using a regression discontinuity design. Co-workers and brothers are 11 and 15 percentage points respectively more likely to take paternity leave if their peer was exogenously induced to take up leave. The most likely mechanism is information transmission, including increased knowledge of how an employer will react. The estimated peer effect snowballs over time. You say here as a first peer interacts with the second peer, the second one with the third, and so on. This leads to a long run participation rate. It leads to long run participation rates which are substantially higher than would otherwise be expected. So this is sort of the way that I understand this information transmission.
Mhm.
X takes paternity leave, employer doesn't react. X prime then say, well, I can take paternity leave too. And then X double prime takes paternity leave as well. But it could go in the other direction too, right? I mean, I was just thinking if we have an employer who doesn't like it, X takes paternity leave and he gets fired, then X prime and X double prime wouldn't take it, right? So what do you
Yeah,
find in
no,
the
that's
data?
true. But that's
Yeah.
not what we found. We found it to be positive, like so.
Yeah, so I'll put my bias on the table, Catherine. So I'm a big fan of Norway. So you guys have got it right. So in Norway, in the data, what we find is that if somebody takes paternity leave and generally is a good thing, then everybody else does it, right? Is that what I'm understanding?
So not really. Like this reform that we analyzed in this paper started in 1993, and then only 2% of fathers before that took any leave. So it was very uncommon. A little bit more like in the US, I think, very few fathers take leave. And then after this reform, where father had 4 non-transferable week, about 35% of father took up the leave. So it was still not 100%. It was still only 35. So it took a long time. I think even now, 20 years later, it was still not that. It was more at like 70, 80%. So it has taken a long time actually to change the norm that fathers take leave, also in Norway. So that was a bit the point of the paper, is to show how this can kind of have positive transmissions through, for example, family networks or coworkers. If someone starts to take it, it might be
Yeah.
a kind of a spillover to other groups that see that, oh, it's okay to actually take it. I don't get fired if I take 4 weeks of paternity leave.
Yeah, so that's what you call the snowball effect
Exactly.
in the system. Um, but there was some sort of discontinuity, right? So if I understand, I didn't read the whole paper,
That I
Catherine. So
understand.
if I understand this correctly, I mean, there was at some point, it was sort of a part of leave, I should say, that the mother and the father could take in combination, and
Exactly.
then the policy changed, right?
Exactly. So they could always split the leave, but then all the mother took everything.
Yeah.
And then they changed the reform such that fathers had to take 4 of the weeks, or the family lost the weeks. So it was non-transferable. So the mother, they would not get it, like the family would not get the leave. And that's what worked. You had to give the very strong incentives. So if it was only shareable, the mother took it. Like so, it had to be this non-transferable part. That was kind of what made the change happen. Mm.
And so would you say from your experience, is that a good policy? I mean, I think the baby will like the mother better than the father. I'm just speculating here. A part of leave that either one can take seems like more optimum in my limited mind. What do you think?
It depends a bit on how you see the norms
Yeah.
playing in. So there is a medical reason for mothers maybe to take the first at least 3 months of leave because of health reasons, both for the mother and baby. But these leaves came after 35 weeks, so it was more when the baby is more like 6 to 12 months. So I don't think the literature has strong views that mothers are much better for the baby than fathers. I think that I think they can both be very good. So the idea
It's
here was that it's very good for equality in the labor market. Also, if the fathers also take some share of the first year of the child, like on the time use. For the
mm,
child's life, and if there are strong norms in the for example labor market that it should be the women that takes it, it can be very hard for men to actually do it if you don't have a policy that also makes it like changes a bit the norm that this can also be shared between the parents.
yeah.
But there
So
is of course a question for whether you should have how big does that shares should be or flexible it should be and so on. I see that point.
yeah. So I mean, there's a sort of an economic question here. So I think generally what happens in the U.S. I don't know much about Scandinavia. Is that the mother and father get together and you say, you have a better job, you go for it, and I will stay behind. There's sort of a prescription um, that's on the surface they want to implement. Um, but I'm very interested in what Norway and Sweden and Scandinavia in general are doing, which is it has a downside, right? So if the family is optimizing motion detected at driveway, if the family is optimizing economics at some level, and that economics is based on whether the father works or the mother works, that's problematic, right, in the long run. So what does your data tell you, and how should we think about this optimally?
Yeah, so I think there is some sort. You have to have some arguments that there are some externalities that the family is not able to take into account. For example, that because of economic reasons, it's difficult for parents to be home with their children, but it's very good for the child, for example, in the first 6 months. Or so if you have some sort of externality, it might be a good idea for that the governments go in and subsidize some of this time, for example. So that is a little bit how the Nordic countries think about it. That there is this kind of it's very important for the mother's health and child health and maybe also the family that the parents are take care of the child in the first year of life, and therefore the government also subsidize this. And the father quota it comes in as more as an equalizing kind of a policy more because we think it's kind of externalities because of these norms in the labor market. That's kind of the rationale for having that. So I think there is an economics through this more externality kind of phase that the family is not really able to optimize these things because they are not able to take into account some of these kind of externalities.
I mean, it's a very complex optimization function, so if my objective is to maximize family wealth, let's say. I'm just making this up, Kat, and I haven't really thought about it.
No, but I think that makes some sense.
And if the male, if the father is making more money, let's say, um, and maybe has better prospects, let's say, I'm just making this up completely. So there is a family optimization objective function that the mother and father could get together and decide, how to do it. I'm not saying that's the right way to do it, but it is sort of a mathematical question, isn't it?
Yeah, but there is a cost then for the women because the women falls out of the labor force, and this might not be a short-term thing. It can be a very long-term thing. Like, so she falls out of the labor force, she will be the weaker part if they divorce and things like that. So there is a lot of cost of kind of not having more equalized like labor markets for women and men. I think that a couple might not take into account, like they're not able to optimize the future necessarily and so on. So I think that's
yeah. So there's something I didn't intuitively think about, which is if in the future something happens and the woman is left behind, and she cannot go back to the workforce because she has been away from it for a longer time, and maybe doesn't have the skills to go back into the workforce. So there is a sort of a strategic cost to this optimization problem that's potentially not taken into account.
exactly, and the literature shows that people are not very good to optimize on this long-term prospects. So in a perfectly economic kind of model, you would take this into account. But I think a lot of research shows that we are not able to kind of plan for the future because of all the uncertainty in some sense of what will happen and so on.
So going back into the paper, then, Katrine. So you're basically saying. So we have a sort of an empirical observation that if somebody takes paternal leave, then somebody else takes it, and then somebody else takes it. And so can I think of this some sort of initial condition in the sense that, I don't know, I mean, some large employer in Norway, there is thousands, tens of thousands of employees, and somebody has to step in and say, I'm going to do this. And then it snowballs from there. Is that the way to think about it?
Yeah, so this, instead of being one big employer, this was the government that kind of told people that it's okay. But a little bit like that, because you needed like for 30 years, men could have done it, but they didn't. So you really needed this big incentive push from it could also be a firm, but you needed like a lot of people to start taking it to start this snowball process. That's about what we show in the paper. Like nothing happened for 30 years, and then 30% of fathers started, and then it really snowballed through the families and through the workplaces over time.
Yeah, it's almost like starting an engine.
Yeah,
you got to start
like
the engine. No?
Exactly.
Yeah.
But you needed this big push, which was a bit the point of the paper, to show that you can change these type of norms, but it takes time, and you need this initial kind of phase, starting point.
So can the government do so? If we know this for sure from empirical data, shouldn't the government be doing something to start that engine in some way? Or could they?
It could be very interesting. I think that could be a good idea, but then you have to believe that. Then you have to believe this externality that I talked about. That there is a reason to subsidize it, and countries have very different views on how much they want to subsidize this. Even within Norway, parties are more or less in favor of this. Like so you have to have arguments on this kind of equality in labor markets or something. And I think lots of countries have very different views on that, on who's in power on this type. But I think that the more broad lesson could be that you may be able to start these engines differently. Like maybe if you firm, like you say, very big employer really makes it easier for people to do it. It could be that could work. Like I haven't studied it exactly, but it makes sense that it could work with other types of incentives than a government subsidy.
Yeah, so places like Norway or Sweden and Scandinavia in general, small populations, a large employer could actually start the engine too. We can do that in the US. We are basically done with in many ways.
Yeah. I think it's much more often employer driven, like and changes in policies in the US. So I'm pretty sure that has happened many times. It's just that it's hard to study it because you don't have the data always to look at it. But
so I want to go to another paper, which is also really interesting. So it's entitled "Incarceration, Recidivism, and Employment." You say here using a random judge design and panel data from Norway, we estimate that imprisonment discourages further criminal behavior, with reoffense probabilities falling by 29 percentage points and criminal charges dropping by 11 over a 5-year period. Ordinary least squares only least squares, I would imagine, regression, mistakenly reaches the opposite conclusion. The decline is driven by individuals not working prior to incarceration. These individuals increase participation in employment programs and raise their future employment and earnings. Previously employed individuals experience lasting negative employment effects. These findings demonstrate that time spent in prison with a focus on rehabilitation can be preventative for a large segment of the criminal population. I'm not exactly sure I don't understand the conclusion. So let me ask you, Katrine. So I don't know much about
this. Of course, I'm happy to answer any questions.
Yeah. So what I understand from the previous part of this is that individuals who don't participate in employment, they go into prison and they come back and they increase participation. Is that right? So
yeah.
And individuals who have had issues in the past or in this current scenario or whatever the case may be, they don't increase employment, right?
No, but they were already employed before, like, so they can still keep their employment. It's just that they don't increase it. Like if anything, we found that they drop out a little bit of the employment actually if you were employed before. But it's also, of course, much more room to increase employment amongst those that are not employed. But what was interesting in that sense was that population was also the ones that reduced their crime. Like, so they were much less likely to recidivist. While those that were employed before, we don't see much change to crime either. Like so it really seems that employment and criminal behavior for that group really belong together after ex-prison. That was kind of the idea.
Yeah, so there's a policy question here, right? So it appears, if I understand this correctly, Catherine, I don't quite understand it. So sending somebody who is sort of employed and sort of in society, let's say, quote unquote, to prison has negative effects.
Yeah, or no effect, I think is maybe better.
Or no effect. But somebody who is already in trouble, let's say, sending
I think
that person,
everyone is in trouble in the sense that they have committed crime. Yeah.
Sending that person to prison, and assuming that the prison is managing the whole situation properly, has positive effects. Is that what you're saying? Or?
That's what we found, yeah. So we found for those that really had maybe more trouble. Everyone has trouble because everyone has committed crime and is going to prison in this population. But we found that if anything, prison helps more for those that were much less attached to the labor market before, and maybe had more, a little bit like you said, more trouble in some sense.
So maybe we need something. I'm just making this up, Kat, and I haven't thought about this. Maybe we need some sort of remedial prison, where we send people who are in terrible trouble. You probably have only 2 people in Norway that fits that definition. We have millions in the US. Some sort of remedial prison. So you go in, you get some training, and your situation was quite bad before you came into the prison, and you go out and you can actually make your situation better. So I see there are 2 types of prison. Is that the way to think about it? I don't know.
I don't know if I can split exactly like that, but I do think one of our points in the paper is that for this population, everyone has committed crime, and for those it looks like on the margin. For some people, prison helps them to get back to kind of a more a life without crime. While the alternative, if they don't go to prison, they just go back to their normal life and commit crime. Like so it seems that it really breaks a bit their habit of committing crime, especially if you're able to train for other. For employment, for example, or there are some rehabilitation efforts in it. So I had a question many times if there are alternatives. Like, couldn't we make this same system outside of prison? But I think there is. It's very hard to answer. But I think there is something about forcing them to have to do it. For example, get up in the morning. You have to attend these things. Like, so if it's voluntary, they won't go. Like, that would be like the typical. So it's very low participation in this. It is these type of programs outside prisons too, in Norway, for example. But it's very few that participate in it when they don't have to. Like, it's.
Yeah. So I mean, from a policy perspective, previously employed individuals experience lasting negative employment effects, which means that if you are sort of integrated, you are a good person for a while, you commit a crime, you almost cannot come back, really.
No, and I think after, so this study was before we had this electronic monitoring, where people were able to serve their sentences at home if they had committed not kind of low this misdemeanor crime. So so this might be a better kind of punishment for that group of people. But we couldn't study that in this paper. But there is a few other research papers that have shown that it could be a better alternative actually to have this type of electronic monitoring. But I think that might not be a good idea for the group where we see that training and the prison is what they really needed, like to get them back on feet. Like, so it's not clear that everyone should have that type of punishment.
So what I'm thinking is that a prison is not a prison, in the sense that sort of the way that we set up prisons would have aggregate suboptimal outcomes, depending on the type of people get in there and the type of people get out. Maybe there's a different way of thinking about it, perhaps. So, let's say person X was pretty good for 40 years and he or she committed one crime, go into prison. When he or she comes out, I think it's going to have a significant negative employment effects, right?
Mm-hmm. Exactly. So so maybe then electronic monitoring might be a much better idea, where they could have kept their job and maybe even but you still need maybe some type of punishment, like if they had committed. I don't know what crime you were thinking about, but
No, yeah.
But our systems are designed a bit for different types of crime. Like we have, I guess in the US too, you can have fines, you can have community services, and you can have we already have a lot of different types. But I'm not sure it's always, and the length of prisons can be very important, of course, and so on. But our paper shows that it's not clear that we even do it like that. There are many ways to think about it, and then it's not clear we do it the right way, I think, in every country.
Yeah. It clearly depends on the country too. So prisons, I mean, at the end of the day, I think we have a different design to think about for prisons, I think, because I think what the paper is arguing is that there are different people who go to the prisons with initial conditions, and the different people who come out of it. And you cannot have an engine, that sort of pumps in and pumps out people based on some general expectation of people going in and coming out, right?
No, that is difficult, I think. But what we could do is we can, for example, have programs in prison that targets some sort of people or something like that. I agree that it's hard to kind of make the prison sentence dependent on your characteristics, but maybe like target based on that could be more kind of programs, or rehabilitation might be more the way to think about it.
Yeah. So I want to go to another paper, which is really interesting. The fatal consequences of brain drain, you see. And you had a lot of data. So this paper examines the welfare consequences of reallocating high-skilled labor across borders. A labor demand shock in Norway, driven by a surge in oil prices, substantially increased physician wages and sharply raised the incentive for Swedish doctors to commute across the border. Leveraging linked register data and dose response difference in difference design, we show that this shift doubled commuting rates and significantly reduced Sweden's domestic physician supply. Yeah, so you have two countries pretty close to each other.
Exactly, they are big borders, like the Mexico-US border almost.
Yes. No, I mean it's not exactly like US and Mexico, because we have cultural differences, we have language issues.
No, of course.
Well,
It's just
you also
the
have
length of the
language.
border. But the length of the border, not it's definitely much more similar in the sense that we have very similar languages and so on.
From a proximity perspective, it's similar. And so, yeah, so oil prices is at the heart of all evil, isn't it? I mean, Norway finds oil, and wages jump up, inflation jump up. Everybody else from Sweden and elsewhere go in there to make more money. But where they go from has significant negative impacts, right? So we'll talk a little bit about this paper, yeah.
Yeah, no, that's exactly what we find, that the areas in Sweden that lost a lot of physicians or doctors, they here you see really increases in mortality rates, especially among elderly, like 60 to 70, 80-year-olds. So it really hurt the kind of population health to lose these physicians, especially in the kind of the when it happens quite quickly. Like, so it's a kind of a long term. So it's not clear that it speaks a bit to this kind of how to allocate healthcare or physicians. Like, so if you drain them out of poorer countries to richer countries, it might not be welfare improving, like, because it might be very bad for the countries that are losing these doctors. Like,
yeah. So I mean, so if economics drives healthcare, I mean that's sort of what we see in the Sweden-Norway case. Let's say, if economics drives healthcare, there could be some policy interventions, right? I mean, I don't know exactly what Sweden did. Could they do something?
Yeah, so I think many countries try to, for example, allocate doctors evenly to maybe poorer areas and so on, just to prevent a little bit these incentives to go to the richer areas to earn more money and so on. But it's very difficult, and I think in Sweden they tried to raise wages, but the wages in Norway increased so much more, so it was very hard for them, because the kind of in Sweden they have a lot of this kind of sectoral bargaining too. So you have this wage floor, so it's very hard to kind of bump in the short run, at least, to go very high. So we do see some increases in wages, but they were not able to retain most of their decisions.
It's a big discontinuity. If I remember my numbers correctly, per capita GDP went from 15,000 to 45,000 or something like that, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, and yeah, you cannot counteract that. I mean,
no, at least not in the short run. And actually, partly in the long run, it partly has kind of equalized more again because of exchange rates and so on. So it's hard to sustain, like, in the long run, but it lasted at least for 10-15 years, actually, this big difference.
My daughter's an OBGYN. I hope Mexico and Canada don't find a lot of oil. Otherwise, in the US, we'll be in bad shape. And what's here is sort of a differential effect, right? So you say here mortality effects were larger in low density physician regions and concentrated in older individuals and acute conditions, circulatory, respiratory, and infectious diseases. Yeah. And so the differential effect is really bad in many ways. So,
No, it exactly
yeah.
hit the population that are low income, low educated, a little bit poor areas more, and so on. So it increased inequality within Sweden because it was hit kind of more rural or poor areas, and it also increased inequality between Norway and Sweden, like because Norway. We didn't decrease mortality in Norway, but we don't find any effects in Norway, and it was increased mortality in Sweden, like so.
So how much of a difference do we find between, so post the big oil shock, how much of the mortality rate differential do we find between Norway and Sweden?
Yeah, so we find that I don't know the exact number, but it did have a substantial impact on the difference. So it was more similar before, and then now Sweden was substantially higher mortality
But
rate.
lifespan actually decreased in Sweden.
Exactly, by 4 months on average, I think. Yeah, that's what we found.
By 4 months. So 4 months is a big thing because
not for every people though. For those affected by it, of course. So if you aggregate it up, it's not like but for 4 months for the areas that were affected.
Yeah, I mean, it's a very interesting lab experiment because we're talking about 8 million people on both sides of the border, and then one country finds something, oil, gold, rare materials. I mean, this could all happen in the future.
Of course, because it was a big shock. It wasn't something we thought a lot about. And Norway was always much poorer than Sweden, actually. We were the little brother of Sweden because they even owned Norway, like if you go back in time, or 200 years. So it was fascinating to see the history of it, where Norway was very much poorer, much more rural and agriculture than Sweden. And then suddenly now we have double GDP of Sweden, even with half the population. So it's kind of...
Yeah. So for globally, can we learn something from it? So, I'm thinking sort of third world countries, maybe in Africa, India, Pakistan, Bangladesh. Is there any lessons here that we could?
So we have to be a bit careful, of course, because. But I think a few things we have been thinking about is that even with these countries that are quite similar, and where Sweden is kind of it's a high-income country too. Like even though Norway is richer, even here you find these pretty big mortality effects. So if this is kind of a lower bound, the mortality effects of losing a lot of healthcare workers in poorer countries are probably much bigger. Like if they lose their physicians or healthcare workers to richer countries. So if you think about it in that sense, and we don't find much effects in Norway. Like it's not clear that this helps a lot of the excess demand in these countries. So I think an overall finding from it is that there is this healthcare crisis in the world a bit in richer countries where we don't have enough healthcare workers, like for very. But it's not clear that we should solve this by kind of importing a lot of healthcare workers from poorer countries. Like it for the world is probably not an increase in it's probably a decrease in total welfare if we do that. So it's something to think about at least.
That's a really interesting question. So Sweden and Norway, sort of similar. Well, I'm making a statement. You can object to it. So in the US, we expect like very, very high dearth in, let's say, healthcare, so doctors in general, right?
Mm-hmm.
And general policy in the US, at least in the current administration, is to not have anybody from outside the US to come into the US. I think this is going to create a big problem. What do you think?
Yeah, exactly. And then of course, internal policy could be to try to allocate them better than at least so that you think that so it's not only the economic opportunity. So the physicians don't go all to the rich areas, but you really try to allocate them better to give them incentives to go to the more rural or more poorer areas too. But this is of course hard. Like it probably then you have to subsidize and the government has to. It's hard to do this. Like individuals would usually always seek out the best opportunities for themselves. Like most people at least will. So it's hard to counteract this without having a lot of policy reforms.
So when the Swedish doctors went out to Norway because the economic opportunities, would they talk the same language?
Yeah, the languages are so similar that you can serve. Yeah, even teachers can actually teach in Norway and speak Swedish. So it's pretty easy to move between the countries, which makes that also interesting in our setting because that was not a barrier to go.
It's not a barrier. So this cannot happen in regions where the languages are quite different. So I'm thinking,
at least, it can at least in the. It depends on the jobs whether they how important language are, I guess. But for some types of physicians, I get if you might not need to meet the people if you're more like an operator, like a surgeon that only are in the surgery or something like that. I guess some types of nurses, but so it really depends on how important the language is, I guess. In the Nordic countries, it's interesting because English is also very a common third language.
Very
so
common,
So most people could. I know a lot of workplaces where you can still get a job without knowing the language that well because you will get along in English and also the customers will be okay.
You can get along with English.
Exactly.
So when the Swedish doctors went into Norway for economic prospects, were they talking English, generally speaking, or what?
So probably they would talk Norwegian because Swedish and Norway was so similar. But we also had a lot of, for example, influx from the other European countries during like the opening of the eastern border in Europe. A lot of lower skilled, for example, workers came in construction and service industry and so on, and then they would be fine speaking English typically. And also nursing partly. So yeah.
And cannot be just. I mean, if your GDP per capita went from 15 to 45, a lot of countries would have been interested, right? I mean, France and England included. No, we didn't see much migration from those areas.
We did see a little bit, but of course, then partly the moving is a big hurdle, like because the prices are also higher in Norway. So I think the distance to Sweden was a bit of a big factor for why Swedes did it, because they could actually commute in to do the work and still go back and live in Sweden and pay the prices.
They could commute. Okay, they could commute.
Exactly.
So are they really driving to Norway?
For the physicians, they would typically fly in to do a little bit of overtime with short flights, but a lot of the other occupations would commute drive in on the border. So that's also very common.
So I'm a complete dearth in geography. So Norway and Sweden are connected by land.
Yeah. They're connected a lot. So for example, Sweden is not very far from Oslo, the main capital of Norway. So you could, for example, live in Sweden and probably commute in a couple of hours with car to Oslo, the big. And on the Swedish side, I think the second or third biggest city is Gothenburg, and that's also not that far from the border. So just to give you an example of a few cities that would not be very far from the border. But then a lot of the border is also a little bit on smaller municipalities that are not that big and don't have the biggest cities that are a little bit more smaller areas. But several of the Norwegian and Swedish cities would be not that far from the border.
So that makes experiment very unique in the sense that so you put two countries very close together, culturally similar, making a statement, you can object to it. Language reasonably similar.
Yes, you can almost think a bit about it as an extended US kind of market. Like it's almost like there is the same country, but they still have a border, I guess.
So then we find when the economics of one region goes up, we see massive. But I think you talked about physicians moving over, but not not other professions, right? Is that
no? So we have looked a bit at that in another paper,
yeah.
but most other professions would only commute from the border because they need to live close to go daily to work. While the physicians were very special because they mostly commuted in to this shift work for a few weeks and then they go back and do their Swedish kind of work. So that makes it a bit different. But the other occupations, it was very common to go also for construction and services and almost all occupations commuted. Like, so we looked at that. It's very interesting. But then it's not mortality. But then we looked a bit at how it affects more the income of these people and kind of the communities that they lived in and on other aspects.
So just concluding a paper. So if I understand this correctly, country Y finds a lot of oil. Economics jumps up significantly. Physicians from country X goes over there because it's easy to go over there. And then we look at the healthcare spectrum of country X. It's bad. High mortality, old people dying, you cannot find a doctor, and all that stuff, right?
Exactly. That's exactly what we find. Yeah. Yeah. So it was especially the hospital sector that was hurt in our paper, at least, that we find that it is the ER, kind of the services where you need acute care, and the hospitals that were struggling to keep up because they lost all these physicians.
So what should Sweden have done in that scenario from a policy perspective?
Yeah, exactly. That's interesting. We look at that a bit in the paper. So we try to simulate if they actually raised wages so much that they kept their doctors. It would really help for like that. That would have prevented because then they could have kept them at the hospitals and so on. Like, but that increase in wages would have been much cheaper than the cost of mortality. You have to have very low cost of mortality to not have done this. Like, but my guess is that they didn't know that that like it's easy to say after, but at that time they probably didn't understand these consequences, like that it would happen.
I mean, so it sort of suddenly hit you, right? So it takes some time to sort of internalize it.
But even 10 years later, we see mortality effects actually. So it took time. Yeah, it's not like it only happened for the first year or something. It was they struggled for many years.
So the Swedish doctors who moved over to Norway, did they stay in Norway? Did they become Norwegians? Or did they
so most of them actually stayed in Sweden and commuted over to do their work. So we don't see that much mobility because of the higher prices in Norway. The incentives wasn't that big to kind of move in. It was the big incentive was to live in Sweden and work in Norway. So we don't see a lot of them become Norwegian in the long run. No.
Yeah, I just hope Mexico doesn't find a lot of oil. Bad. Excellent. Thanks so much for spending time with me, Katrine.
Of course, thank you for very interesting questions.
It's very late in Norway, I know. Thank you.
Thank you very much.